All right, this is still part of Chapter 1 in Course 1, Lesson 1, and if you look here, you're going to notice that we are on the last part of Lesson 1, and that's Part E. Your last lesson was Part D, and what we talked about in Part D was kind of the picture model of what's happening when you're multiplying a decimal by a decimal to get an understanding using those base 10 blocks, what I mean when you take a tenth times a tenth and how that ends up being equivalent or the same as sometimes a hundredth, and then also getting familiar with moving those decimal places. So if you look at the main idea or your objective for today, kind of sticking to that theme before we move on to division, is multiplying decimals by decimals. And I want to make sure by tomorrow that you guys are pretty comfortable with this before we move on to division, because it's an important piece that you have. All right, so let's take a look. This is from your book. Um, We'll look at a story situation, and then we'll run through some examples of multiplying decimals by decimals, and and then that will be the end of it. So let's start with this first one here. We're going to talk about planets, and then we're going to look at the table that shows the weight of a 1-pound object on each planet. So what the actual weight of a 1-pound object on each of these planets would be. Okay, so number 1 says 5/10 pound object weighs 1/2 as much as a 1-pound object. Okay, so 5/10, we also say that as, sometimes you hear 0.5, or if you even just look at 5/10, you'll know that that's a half of a whole. What would this object weigh on Jupiter? So we're going to go over here and see that a 1-pound object on Jupiter weighs 2 3/10 pound. Okay, we want to know what a half-pound object would weigh. So we want to take this and multiply it by 5/10. I really stressed this to you guys today when I was working with you to really not pay attention to that decimal and kind of do your standard multiplication, and then at the end figure out where your decimal goes. And the more we get comfortable with that, the more we'll use and talk about the language of what's happening. So when we have 5/10 times 3/10, okay, and we're going to say that's 15/10. Carry that 1 whole. Then we have 5 times 2 is 10, plus that 1 whole is 11. Okay, when we have 0 right here, we can put our place value holder in and start with 0 and say 0 times 3 is 0 and 0 times 2 is 0, and then add those up. Some students feel comfortable with that, but you recognize already that's just a row of zeros, so you can eliminate that step too. 5, 1, and 1. Now once we have finished our multiplication, now we're going to look back up at our equation and see how many decimal places we have. We have 1 and 2 and 3/10, and we have 1 and 5/10. So add those two together, we have 2 place values. So starting from your right, you're going to move over 2 decimal places, and now we'll have our new product of 1 and 15/100ths. Okay. So so looking at that and then getting down to 1 and 15/100ths. Okay. What would an object that weighs 5 pounds on Earth weigh on Jupiter? Okay, so Jupiter, once again, if a 1-pound object is 2 and 3/10, so now we're going to take a 5-pound object and we're going to weigh it on that. So we would take the 2 and 3/10. Let's go ahead and erase this. So we have 2 and 3/10 on Jupiter, and we're going to multiply that by 5. Okay, 5 times 3/10, 15/10. 5 times 2 is 10, and then we're going to add that other whole, and now we have 11. We have 1 place value here in the decimal place, so we're going to have 1 here. So we're going to have 11 and 5/10 of a pound. Okay, kind of going back to what we first did was taking a decimal times a whole number. All right. So doing this multiplication, and we're going to realize this as we move on, that You can see the results of 1 and 2 by simply taking 23 and multiplying it by 5. And when you're ending up with your product of 115, it's going to work for each of them, but for each of them you're going to have a different amount of or decimal places. So we take 115. In number 1, we know that we're taking, we have 2 places in the decimal, or we have 1 here, excuse me, in 2 and 3/10, and then we have 1 in 5/10. So then our product needs to have 2 decimal places. So we should have 1 and 15/100. However, in the second one, we're taking the whole number 5 times 2 and 3/10, so we only have 1 decimal place. So we're only going to move 1 decimal place in our product, and ending up with 11 and 5/10. Sometimes students really like thinking about it that way with just the multiplication, multiplying them as whole numbers and then going back and putting the decimal places in, really not focusing on what's happening with the numbers and place value, but the more comfortable you get, the more we can play around with what is happening with those numbers. So let's go to some examples. And let's scroll down here. That is not where I wanted to go. Pardon me. So looking at our 2 examples here on this page, we're trying to find the product of 4 and 2/10 times 6 and 7/10. Okay. We have 1 decimal place in 4 and 2/10 and 1 decimal place in 6 and 7/10. Multiplying it out, you'll see that they left a space here. But I always encourage you to put a 0 instead of leaving that extra space. The 0 just helps hold that place so that you don't have a silly mistake when you're doing your multiplication. Adding up those 2 products with your final, so you'd end up with 2814, and then making sure that you represent those 2 place values in your product, so ending up with 28 and 14/100. Okay. Same down here, 3 and 6/10, multiplying that by 5/100. You'll notice that they multiplied just by 5/100. They didn't multiply by the 0 in the 10th place and the 0 in the 1's place. So 5 times 6 is 30. 0 comes down. Carry the 3. 5 times 3 is 15, plus the 3 over here is 18. Okay, and then what they did was they noticed that there's 1 place value on top and 2 decimal place values below, combined for 3 decimal places, moved it over 3, and then they put a 0 in the 1's place. Okay, so we also can write this product as 180 thousandths, or we can say 18/100. Okay, so written as 180 thousandths or 18/100. And we'll look at that with base 10 blocks tomorrow and why that works the way that it does. You might remember that from 4th grade when we were talking about understanding decimal places. Okay, so let's check where we're at right now and do maybe 2 of these examples, and then I will finish the video, and then tomorrow come with your questions, bring your worksheet from today, and we'll really kind of tackle the multiplication steps of this, and then we'll also look at why it works the way that it does as we get more comfortable with it. So let's start with A. We have, I'm going to get this other work out of here. We have 5 and 7/10, multiplying that against 2 and 8/10. You also, like I said before, and we'll get comfortable with it, but just for the sake of multiplication, you can think of that as 57 times 28. I mean, I don't want you to get in that habit, but for some of you, that might be a step, an intervention step, if you're getting confused by the decimal places. So 8/10 times 7/10, we're going to end up with 56 hundredths, so we put the 6 down, and 8 times 5 is 40, plus the 5, 45. Now we're starting our next multiplication with 2, so we have to put that place value holder in. Now we're going to start with 2 times 7, 14. 2 times 5 is 10, plus 1, and we're going to have 11. Take those two, and now we're going to add them up. 6, 9, 5, 1. And now what we're going to do is we'll go back and we'll look back at how many decimal place values we have. We have 1 here, and we have 1 here. So combine those, we should have 2 decimal places. 1, 2. So our final product, we should have 15 and 96 hundredths. Okay. Erasing that. Let's do the second one. 4 and 12 hundredths times 5 hundredths. Okay, multiplying that out. 5 times 2. 5 times 1, 5. And then we're going to add that extra 6. 5 times 4, 20. These two are zeros. We could go in and add the zeros to the bottom, but we know that we're just going to have rows and rows of zeros. So right now we're going to look at how many decimal places we have. We have 2 in the top number, and we have 2 below. So we should have 4 decimal places in our product. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to put a 0 in the ones place to hold that place value. Looking at our final product, we can say we have 2,060 10,000ths, or we know that we can take that 0 off because it means the same as 206 thousandths. All right. Bring that worksheet with you tomorrow. We're really going to dive deep into multiplying decimals by decimals and getting very comfortable with this concept so that we can move on to division of decimals. Thank you for watching the video, and have a good night, you guys.